I wasn't my son's mother anymore. I was his household staff. That's the only way I can describe it now, looking back. Because somewhere between my husband Gerald's funeral and the morning my daughter-in-law Vanessa left a typed cleaning schedule on my kitchen counter, with my name at the top and a little checkmark column on the side. That's exactly what I had become. My name is Frances Holloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school English in Oakville, Ontario, and I retired 14 months ago with a small pension, a garden I'd been neglecting for decades, and plans, real plans, to finally live the second half of my life for myself. Gerald and I had talked about it for years. A trip to Halifax, mornings without alarm clocks, learning to paint watercolors at the community center on Dundas. Small things, quiet things, things that felt enormous after a lifetime of being needed by everyone else. Gerald died 11 months before I retired. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel, the way that particular disease tends to be. One October he was coaching our neighbor's son in backyard hockey. By January he was gone. I don't say this so you'll feel sorry for me. I say it because you need to understand what kind of shape I was in when my son, Elliot, started calling. At first, the calls were sweet. "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay. Mom, you shouldn't be in that house alone. Mom, why don't you come for dinner Sunday?" I went. Of course I went. What widow with a freshly empty house wouldn't? And then Sunday dinners became Sunday dinners, plus picking up the children from school on Fridays. And then that became Monday mornings too, because Vanessa had a Pilates class. And then somewhere, I'm still not entirely sure how, it became 5 days a week, and I was packing lunches and signing permission slips, and knowing which of their 3 children had a nut allergy, and which one needed his inhaler in his backpack on gym days. Elliot and his wife Vanessa Marchetti Holloway had 3 kids, Owen, who was 9, and the twins Piper and Declan, who had just turned 6. They were good children. I want to say that clearly. They were funny and loud and absolutely exhausting in the way that children are when they are deeply, confidently loved. I adored them. I'm not telling you this story because of them. I'm telling it because of the Tuesday morning I arrived at their house in Burlington, which took me 40 minutes each way on the QEW, and found a laminated schedule on the kitchen island. It was printed on Vanessa's work letterhead. The header said Household Coordination. Weekly Plan. My name appeared in the Tuesday and Thursday columns under School Pickup and After School Care, and in a separate row labeled Deep Clean, Rotating Rooms, there was a small asterisk next to my name with a note at the bottom. Frances prefers mornings. I had not said I preferred mornings. I had never agreed to deep clean anything. I stood in that kitchen for a long time, holding the laminated page, reading my own name in 12-point calibri, and thinking, when did this happen? When did I stop being Elliot's mother and become a line item in a household spreadsheet? I put the schedule down. I didn't say anything. That was my first mistake, and I knew it even as I was making it. But I had been a teacher for 31 years, and teachers learn early that not every battle is worth the oxygen it would cost. I told myself I would talk to Elliot that weekend. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself Vanessa was stressed. She was a project manager at a tech firm in Mississauga, and the hours were genuinely brutal, and that she hadn't meant it the way it looked. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. I made the mistake of mentioning it to my friend, Paulette Girard, who had been my closest friend since we were both young mothers in the same Oakville neighborhood 25 years ago. Paulette has a gift for saying exactly what you're not ready to hear. "Frances," she said, stirring her tea at my kitchen table. "You know what they call what's happening to you?" I didn't answer. "Invisible labor," she said, "except you're not even invisible. You're laminated." I laughed. Then I didn't. The conversation with Elliot that weekend didn't happen the way I'd planned. He was tired. He was always tired. He worked long hours at his engineering firm, and I had learned over the past year that the tired look around his eyes was something I instinctively wanted to fix, the same way I'd wanted to fix things when he was 8 and struggling with long division. So instead of saying, "Elliot, I saw the schedule and I want to talk about it," I said, "You look exhausted, sweetheart. Let me make you something to eat." He smiled, relieved, and the moment passed. I drove home on the QEW in the dark and thought about Gerald. I thought about how Gerald used to say, "Frances, You don't have to earn your place at the table. You are the table. He meant it as a compliment. I was only now starting to understand how it had also been, in some quiet way, a warning. The months that followed are difficult to describe without sounding like I'm cataloging grievances, which is not the point of this story. The point is that I tried. I tried to set boundaries the way all the books suggest, calmly, directly, without anger. I told Elliot in February that I couldn't do Mondays anymore because I had signed up for a watercolor class. He nodded, said, "Of course, Mom!" And the following Monday, Vanessa texted me at 7:30 in the morning. "Hey, Francis, just a reminder, Owen has orthodontist at 3:30 today. Can you grab him from school and take him? I'll pick up the twins myself." I went. Because it was Owen, and he hated the orthodontist, and I knew he'd hold my hand in the waiting room and pretend he wasn't. In March, I told Vanessa directly, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table, keeping my voice even, that I needed to scale back. I said I was happy to help on weekends sometimes, but that weekday childcare had to be handled differently going forward. She listened. She nodded. She said, "Absolutely, Francis, we totally understand." Then she looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at his hands. 3 days later, I got a text from Elliot that said, "Mom, Vanessa's working late Thursday, and I have a site meeting I can't move. Can you just do this week?" It won't happen again. It happened again the following Thursday. I want to tell you that I was surprised, but I wasn't. I think what I felt was something much quieter and sadder than surprise. I felt erased. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It was the slow kind of erasing, like when you write on a whiteboard and don't quite clean it properly. And one morning you come in and you can see the ghost of everything that was there before. That was me. A ghost of the woman I'd been planning to become. The watercolor class. I had missed half the sessions already. My instructor, a gentle retired architect named Howard, who spoke about color the way Gerald had spoken about hockey, had stopped saving me a spot by the window, the garden. Still just dirt and dead stems from the autumn before. Halifax. Gerald's dream as much as mine. We had a folder on the computer desktop. Literally a folder, the kind you right-click and create, called Halifax 2024. Inside it were screenshots of inns near the waterfront, a list of restaurants Paulette had recommended, ferry schedules to Dartmouth. I opened the folder one night in April, sitting alone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock, after driving home from Burlington in the rain, and I just looked at it for a long time. Then I opened a new tab and started searching for flights. I want to be clear that I did not plan to disappear. That word, disappear, makes it sound more dramatic, more pointed than it actually was. What I planned was a vacation, 11 days, Halifax, Nova Scotia. I booked a room at a small inn near the historic properties, walking distance from the water. I booked a whale-watching tour for day 3, because Gerald had always wanted to see a whale, and now I was going to see one for both of us. I booked a cooking class. I made a reservation at a restaurant in the North End that had been written up in Maclean's. I paid for all of it, with the travel savings account Gerald and I had been adding to for 11 years, the one Vanessa didn't know existed, because it was none of Vanessa's business. And then, this part I am not entirely proud of, but I am not going to pretend it didn't happen. I did not tell anyone I was leaving until the night before. I texted Elliot at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday in early May. The text said, "I'm taking a trip. Leaving tomorrow morning. I'll be back on the 18th. I've arranged for Mrs. Kowalski next door to collect my mail. I'll be in touch when I can." His response came in 4 minutes. "Mom, what? Where are you going?" "We need to talk about this." I put my phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep. I want to tell you that sleep came easily, but that would be a lie. I lay there for a long time listening to the particular silence of a house that has been empty of the person you built it around. But underneath that silence there was something new, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A low hum, not excitement exactly, more like the early sound of something that had been switched back on. My phone, when I picked it up in the morning, had 11 messages and 2 missed calls. Elliot, Vanessa, Elliot again, a voicemail from Vanessa that I listened to in the driveway with my suitcase already in the trunk. "Francis, I think you need to understand how this looks. The kids are asking where you are, and I don't know what to tell them. If you could just call Elliot back before you go, that would be really." I put the phone in my bag and drove to Pearson. The flight to Halifax takes about 2 hours. I had a window seat. I ordered a ginger ale and watched the cloud cover break somewhere over New Brunswick. And when the Nova Scotia coastline came into view, gray and green and impossibly beautiful, I started crying. Not the sad kind. The other kind. The kind you cry when you've been holding your breath for so long that the exhale itself is a shock. Halifax in May is cold and bracing, and smells like salt and something old. I love it in a way I did not expect. My inn, run by a soft-spoken woman named Doris, who brought tea to the common room at 4 o'clock without being asked, was exactly what it had looked like online. Creaking floors, a quilt on the bed, a window that looked out over rooftops to a sliver of the harbor. I slept 9 hours the first night. I walked the waterfront the next morning with a coffee from a tiny Portuguese bakery on Vargington Street, and I thought, Gerald would have loved this. He would have pointed at every boat and told me its name and probable history, and I would have pretended to be less interested than I was. I thought about him without the usual weight. That was new too, the messages continued. Elliot texted twice a day, morning and evening, with a regularity that was almost impressive, given how rarely he had called before I left. On day 3, I got a text that said, Mom, we're worried about you. Can you just let us know you're okay? I responded, I'm fine, Elliot. I'll be home on the 18th. On day 5, he texted, Vanessa wants to know if you're angry about something. I put the phone away and went whale watching. We saw a humpback, enormous and unhurried, surface about 30 meters from the boat. The woman next to me grabbed my arm without thinking, and we both laughed, strangers sharing something enormous. I thought, This is what I was missing. On day 7, my phone rang while I was at the cooking class, a lesson on classic maritime seafood chowder, led by a chef named Bernard, who was funny and impatient in the way that great teachers often are. I let it ring. When I checked later, it was a Halifax number. I nearly dismissed it as a wrong number. Then I listened to the voicemail. It was Elliot. He was calling from a hotel in downtown Halifax. He had flown out that morning, he and Vanessa both. I sat down on the edge of the bed in my room at Doris's inn and listened to his voice saying, Mom, we're here. We're not trying to ruin your trip. I just need to talk to you, please. My first feeling was anger. It was clean and immediate, and I want to be honest about that. My second feeling, rising just underneath it, was something more complicated. Because the voice on that voicemail did not sound like the Elliot who had nodded and said, of course, and then sent Vanessa's texts the next morning. It sounded like a younger version of him, uncertain, a little frightened. I called him back. We met at a coffee shop near the waterfront, the 3 of us. Elliot arrived first. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was satisfying in a way I'm not entirely proud of. Vanessa came in a few minutes later and she looked different from how she usually did at home. Smaller. Somehow, she sat down across from me and didn't speak first, which was unusual. I let the silence sit. Elliot started. He said he was sorry. Not the reflexive sorry, the kind that means please stop being upset with me. He said it slowly, like he'd been thinking about the exact shape of it on the flight over. He said he hadn't understood what they'd been asking of me because he hadn't let himself look at it clearly, and looking at it clearly was uncomfortable, and he had chosen not to do it. That was a more honest thing than I had expected him to say. Then Vanessa spoke. She said that she had told herself the arrangement was mutual, that I was there because I wanted to be. She said she'd convinced herself that because I never said no clearly enough, that meant yes. She said that when I left, she had been angry, and then she had been scared, and then she had been ashamed. She said the shame was the worst. I listened to all of it. I didn't cry, and I didn't perform stoicism either. I just listened the way I used to listen to students who were finally saying the real thing after a semester of saying the easier thing. Then I said, I spent 11 months being erased. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it as accurately as I can. I stopped having a schedule that was mine. I stopped finishing books I was reading because I was too tired by 7 o'clock. I missed most of a class I'd been looking forward to for 2 years. I drove to Burlington 430 times. I had actually counted. I had been counting since February, and not once did either of you ask how I was doing before you asked what I could do for you. Elliot looked at his hands. Vanessa looked at the table. I am Owen's grandmother, I said. I am Piper and Declan's grandmother. That is a privilege and a joy, and I want it for the rest of my life. But I am not your housekeeper. I am not your childcare worker. I am not a line item on a laminated schedule. Vanessa looked up when I said laminated schedule, a flicker of something across her face, recognition, maybe. Or the awareness that I had seen more than she'd realized. We're going to hire a nanny, Elliot said. A real one. I've already started looking. Good, I said. And the cleaning. We'll sort that ourselves. Good, I said again. We sat for a moment. Outside, a fishing boat was moving slowly through the harbor. A group of school children was walking past on the waterfront, all of them in matching yellow vests. 2 teachers at the front counting heads with that particular expression teachers. Get alert and quietly exhausted and completely, utterly responsible. I knew that feeling. I had been that feeling. Mom, Elliot said. I'm sorry. I mean it. I looked at my son, at this man who had once been small enough to carry, who had once cried in the orthodontist's waiting room and pretended he hadn't, who had lost his father 11 months before I lost my husband, and I felt the anger settle into something softer and more durable. I know you do, I said, and I forgive you, but you need to understand that forgiveness isn't the same as going back to how things were. He nodded. He looked relieved and a little chastened, which was exactly right. I paid for my own coffee. Then I told them I had 4 more days in Halifax, and I intended to use all of them, and I hoped they'd enjoy the city. It was worth the trip, genuinely, but that I would see them when I got home on the 18th. Vanessa said quietly, That's fair. I walked back to the inn along the waterfront. The afternoon was cool and bright, the kind of May afternoon that feels like a promise. The harbor was calm. I stopped at the railing and watched the water for a while, and I thought about Gerald's folder on the desktop. Halifax 2024 opened 3 years late, and I thought, we got here. Just me, but we got here. The remaining 4 days were mine entirely. I finished my cooking class. I went back to the Portuguese bakery 3 more times because the coffee was that good. I bought a small watercolor set at an art supply shop on Spring Garden Road and sat on a bench near the public gardens and made something that looked a little like trees and a lot like hope. On the flight home, I looked at my phone. There were no texts from Elliot. He had understood, apparently, that I'd meant what I said. There was one text from Paulette. It said, Howard saved your spot by the window. He said the morning light's been particularly good this week. I landed at Pearson at 4:30 in the afternoon. I drove home to Oakville. I unlocked my front door, set my suitcase in the hall, and walked through to the kitchen. The Serge's house was quiet in the way it always was now, the specific quiet of a space that has been shaped by a life shared and is now held alone. But this time the quiet felt different. Not emptier than before. Fuller. There is a certain age, I think, and I don't know when it arrives for everyone, but I know when it arrived for me, when you stop waiting for other people to understand that you matter, and you simply begin to act like someone who does us. It doesn't feel like rebellion. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like remembering something true about yourself that you'd let other people borrow for too long. I went out to the garden the next morning with Gerald's old work gloves and my coffee, and I started clearing the sticks in the dead stems from the autumn before. The ground was still cold. The work was harder than I expected. By noon, I had 2 black bags for the compost, and hands that ached, and something that was beginning slowly and honestly to look like a garden again. Owen called that evening to say he'd learned from his dad that I'd been in Halifax, and had I seen any whales, and when I told him about the humpback, 30 meters, enormous, unhurried, he was quiet for a second, and then said, Grandma, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. I laughed. I really laughed. Some things, I was learning, you have to go all the way to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean to remember.